Hello, my name is Frances Spalding, and I've been invited to give a Darwin lecture this year, which is a great honour. The theme is revolution, quite a difficult theme, but very fascinating, and something that's both exciting and troubling. My talk is titled Worlds Turned Upside Down, Quiet Revolutions in Art. So I think it's very fascinating to look at art, because particularly 20th century modern and contemporary art is full of revolutionary spirit. And I hope anyone who's listening will enjoy what happens in the lecture. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to our 6th Darwin lecture on the theme of revolution. Once again, it's wonderful to have a full hall here. This week, as I'm sure you know, our speaker is an art historian, critic and biographer, Professor Frances Spalding. She read history at the University of Nottingham and gained a PhD for a study of the English painter Roger Fry. Professor Spalding began writing for the Times Literary Supplement, the Burlington Magazine, and art journals while she was still a postgraduate. She then went on to teach the history of art at Sheffield City Polytechnic and then became a professor of art history at the University of Newcastle. She is now an emeritus fellow at Clare Hall College here in Cambridge, a fellow of the Royal Society for Literature, an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Art. And in 2005, she was, of course, made a CBE for services to literature. Frances has a particular interest in 20th century British art and has written biographies of many well-known British artists. She has a very special connection to Darwin College, having written a biography of Gwen Raverath. Gwen was a daughter of the astronomer, Professor Sir George Howard Darwin, and a granddaughter of the naturalist Charles Darwin. Our college, now celebrating its 60th anniversary, was the family home for the Darwin family for over 80 years. And it was the place where Gwen Raverath grew up and then lived as a widow. Gwen became a world-renowned wood engraver, artist and writer, and of course wrote her classic childhood memoir period piece about growing up in Newnham Grange, which is the cornerstone of what is now the college's estate. So, Frances, it is lovely to welcome you back to Darwin College and the Darwin community, and thank you for joining us this evening to deliver your lecture entitled Worlds Turned Upside Down, The Quiet Revolutions in Art. Please join me in welcoming.
Well, thank you, Master, and Darwin College, and all those involved with the organisation of the 2024 Darwin Lectures for the opportunity to deliver a talk in this series, a series that is free and open to all. Having been one in a team of 3 that ran the public lectures programme at Newcastle University for some 3, almost 4 years, I am very aware that a hunger for knowledge is active not only inside universities, but very much so in the outside world. And public lectures sit very satisfactorily at the interface between the two. Now, as we have heard in these lectures, revolutions can take many forms, and however forceful, ambitious, or much needed they may be, they can disappoint, turn messy, or fail. Yet the revolutionary spirit is something that continues to arouse admiration. Why? Because it answers questions, energizes debate, refuses false conclusions, protests, unsettles the status quo, seeks new solutions and social improvements. Radical ideas always have a political edge and can lead, as we know, to revolutions of the bloodiest and most humane kind. And yet there are many ways of discussing revolutionary ideas, adversarial and activist on the one hand, or on the other through more persuasive and quieter modes of resistance. This evening we will look at aspects of the revolutionary spirit in 20th century art, where it ran like wildfire in both theory and practice, at times in response to the Western European tradition, and at other times in opposition to it. And we will look at some examples of contemporary art to remind ourselves of revolutionary pockets at work in today's world. My title is taken from a ballad, World Turned Upside Down, which was published as a broadside in 1646, a period that left some of the deepest scars in English history. But this ballad seems to me on the surface a light-hearted protest against Parliament's attempt to turn Christmas into a solemn affair by outlawing traditional Christmas decorations, then seen to be closely associated with Catholicism. The first verse of this ballad reads as follows: "Listen to me, and you shall hear news that hath not been this 1,000 year, since Herod, Caesar, and many more you've never heard the like before. Holy days are despised, new fashions are devised. Old Christmas is kicked out of town. Yet let's be content, and the times lament. You see the world turned upside down." This phrase, world turned upside down, is repeated at the end of every verse. It was seized on by the Marxist historian Christopher Hill and used as the title for his 1972 book, subtitled Radical Ideas. Must remember to turn things on. Radical Ideas During the English Revolution. Hill points out that this phrase, or words close to it, appear 3 times in the Bible. It's certainly a phrase ripe with metaphorical possibilities, apt and useful in our present distracted times. It is also a phrase the sense of which depends on your viewpoint. Here is a print made by Wenceslas Holler of Arundel. If you take the train from London to Chichester, you will know the pleasure of suddenly seeing the town of Arundel and its cathedral and castle perched on a small hill. But the castle you see is largely Victorian reconstruction, not the magnificent castle rolling down the hillside in this image. History did not hop over Arundel, writes Alexandra Harris in her new book, The Rising Down, before reminding us how this area was dominated by ancient Catholic families, when in 1643 a large parliamentarian army arrived under William Waller, which pressed the royalists back into the castle and held it under siege, also drained the lake from which its water was obtained. Many died from dysentery or typhus. Although those remaining in the garrison did not finally surrender until the 6th of January 1644, the castle had been recaptured by parliamentary forces in December and then slighted with the destruction of the original Great Hall and the southwest curtain wall to prevent it being fortified again. Yet none of this destruction is shown in the print, which Holler described in the left-hand corner as Facit 1644. Was it his decision then to turn the world upside down again, to return Arundel to what it was before the war began, to recreate it in memory as a memorial, for art has many purposes? When sitting down to write this Darwin lecture, I mentioned to Jascha Reichhardt the overall theme given to this year's speakers. Jascha is herself, though now in her 90s, a revolutionary figure. In 1968, after some 2 years' research, mostly in America, she curated the first major international exhibition of computer art, and which was displayed in the Institute of Contemporary Art in London. What a good title for a series of lectures, Jascha wrote to me. Revolution, it could mean anything, of course, and the only constant is the idea of a vital change from the present. Well, this encouraged me to my wish to think about radical developments not only in the past, but also as part of the throb and hum of the present. I therefore changed the first word in my title from world to worlds to suggest a focus on finite things and a more fragmented approach. Writing this lecture has been a considerable pleasure, but there were moments when I felt rather like Gwen Raverar, Charles Darwin's granddaughter, when she was faced with yet another dancing class, having been sent out of the room during the previous lesson. Do you remember how in her book Period Piece, about her Edwardian and Victorian childhood, she goes under the dining room table, adopts the famous pose of the infant Samuel, and prays that the dancing teacher will be dead by the time the class comes round? So permit me to go further and use this Darwin lecture as a platform on which to express my gratitude to the Darwin family for the encouragement given me when I wrote the biography of Gwen. One thing very evident from the letters and other documents made available to me was the strong sense of the Darwin family identity and its almost tribal loyalty to the memory of Charles Darwin. Gwen's husband was French. This I need to explain. Jacques Raverar was his name, but having been sent to a boarding school in England, Bedales, he came out of it called Jakes and not Jacques, having performed a character called Jakes in a Shakespeare play. And in time his surname also, because it is not easy on the English ear, underwent alteration and is today usually anglicised fully as Raverat. However, Gwen herself, after widowhood, kept her husband's name semi-anglicised and always referred to herself as Gwen Raverar. But to return to Jakes, he occasionally found the goodness of the Darwins and their strong sense of family identity overwhelming. Jakes felt this in 1916 when living at Newnham Grange, as you've heard now, Darwin College, waiting for Gwen to give birth to their first child. "Sometimes I sit and long for a really good scandal in the Darwin family," he wrote to a friend, "like adultery or Roman Catholicism." Recently, I found this small booklet that you see on the right of your screen. It announces itself thus: speeches and other observations made at a lunch and gathering of the Barlow, Cornford, Darwin, Hambro, Keynes, Pryor and Wedgwood tribes at the Garden House Hotel, Cambridge, now sadly burnt down, on July the 8th, 2001, to celebrate the publication of the biography of Gwen Raverar by Frances Spalding. It was a truly splendid occasion, put on, if I remember correctly, by Gwen's two daughters, Sophie Pryor and Elizabeth Hambro. Standing in the garden before lunch with a glass of wine, I found myself chatting to two elderly gentlemen I had not met before. At one moment, a young man, almost certainly the hotel manager, with a very cropped haircut and a sharp dog-tooth jacket, squeezed past us. "I don't recognize him," remarked one of my two companions. "No, no," the other replied, "not a Darwin, too crisp." But let's return to the world turned upside down and give attention to the revolutionary in art in large and small ways, to the shock of the new, to revolutionary tactics, to moments when art seeks to expand or question the accepted canon in art, or pushes the Western gaze aside and makes alliances with countries and cultures very different to our own. As mentioned, my intention is to concentrate on modern and contemporary art, but I cannot talk about revolution in art without mentioning Giotto di Bondone. He's certainly one of the most revolutionary artists in the entire history of art. He is, of course, often regarded as the father of European art and the first of the great Italian masters. He is intensely relevant to our theme, for in a time of great conservatism, when sacred figures were usually set against a gold background and were symbolic, not real, Giotto abruptly broke with the solemn rigidity and grandeur of Byzantine art. Don't forget that in Giotto's days, apprentices were never encouraged to draw what they saw around them, in nature or the everyday world, but instead were expected to copy from pattern books or existing illustrations, or to assist with the making of workshop copies. Invention and imagination were not encouraged. Giotto did have a predecessor in Cimabue, but as his contemporary Dante informs us, in painting Cimabue thought he held the field, and now it's Giotto they acclaim, the former only keeps a shadowed fame. and time has upheld this claim, for it was Giotto who changed the whole purpose and direction of painting. Whereas Byzantine art firmly upheld tradition and the necessity of staying within permitted ways of portraying images of Christ or Mary, Giotto wanted to get closer to the vivid realism found in the sculpture of this period, notably in the porches of northern cathedrals. He did so by rediscovering how to create illusion of depth on a flat surface, in other words, plausible space and plausible figuration, thereby opening painting to a whole new world. No longer need the artist be hidebound by the words of the sacred stories, nor did he have to struggle to find new ways of using time-honored models. Giotto realized he could re-enliven a scene by bringing to it an understanding of how figures stand, move, occupy space, engage with others, and express emotion. I was pleased to discover earlier this week that in 1978, Ernst Gombrich gave what was either the second or the third, there's some dispute over this, I think it was the second annual lecture in 1978, and it only became a series, I think it was in the mid-1980s. Gombrich was then professor of the history of the classical tradition at the Warburg Institute at the University of London. In the course of his lecture, his Darwin lecture, he talks about grief, grief in art, making reference to Greek examples. He differentiates between lament and grief, and infers that the former is more often formulaic and official in its manner of representation. He notes that some did not convey well enough that we are in the presence of death, and that this can be changed if a valedictory mood is conveyed, or if the stilling of outward gestures begins to make possible the articulation of mourning. For Gombrich, creativity is inseparable from articulation, and if the artist in the course of this articulation is able to draw on his or her own experience, knowledge, or feelings, a degree of authentication begins to enter the work. At the same time, he argues, the work will reflect back to the artist what has been put into it, and this recognition, this sort of mutual recognition, creates a give and take and unity between the maker and the work. Gombrich quotes Picasso, "I don't seek, I find." Look again at this Giotto fresco and see what he has found. Look at how the eyes of all the mourners direct our attention towards Christ, whose dead body has just been taken down from the cross. Notice how Giotto creates a sense of involvement through the significance he gives to hands. 5 of these mourners reach out to support Christ's head, hands, and feet, while St. John leans forward, flinging his arms out sideways, hands open, conveying an unexpected gesture, either of sorrowful acceptance or protest. No wonder that Giotto's fame spread far and wide, and anecdotes about his dexterity and wit were often told. Previously, scant attention had been given to the names of artists and craftsmen, but Giotto opened up an entire chapter in the history of art. As Gombrich said, a quiet revolution had occurred, even though it took another 100 years for the Renaissance to get going properly. But from this day onwards, as Gombrich points out, the history of art, first in Italy and then in other countries also, became the history of great artists. This, combined with the example laid down by Vasari's Lives of Artists, has led, I think, to an overemphasis on the monographic tradition in art publishing. An attempt to get away from this and introduce new models has been noticeable in recent years. But let's now leap forward to the early 20th century and look at another revolutionary painting, very well known, Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, begun 1906 and completed, if it is completed, in 1907. What was shocking and disturbing about this picture in the early 20th century was not the fact that these women are prostitutes touting for clients, but because Picasso, employing diverse sources, including African art, seems to be shaking his fist at a long tradition that looks to the female nude as something almost sacred, a source of beauty, perfection, seduction, or repose. A brothel, as John Berger remarked in his book The Success and Failure of Picasso, may not in itself be shocking, but women painted without charm or sadness, without irony or social comment, women painted like the palings of a stockade through which eyes look out as at death. That is shocking. Now, what makes that comment apposite is the all-important background ingredient to my lecture, the Western European tradition, widely regarded as one of the most hallowed traditions in the history of the world's culture. Many great artists, as well as great cities, have over the centuries contributed to it, yet it remains an umbrella term, loosely referring to the diverse heritages that fed into it. The terms Western culture or Western civilization are sometimes used in its place, but all these titles, when broadly defined, find their roots in the foundations laid down by the Greco-Roman civilization and the tenets of Western Christianity. One of its high points, of course, in the history of art is the Italian Renaissance, and particularly the period of the High Renaissance with the triumvirate of Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo, the latter referred to by Vasari as Il Divino. No wonder that subsequent artists working in Italy struggled to get under the weight of the huge shadow cast by the Renaissance, and that one of the earliest revolutionary protests against the Western European tradition took the form of Italian futurism. The man you see on the screen is Marinetti, who more or less brought this movement into existence by writing the first Futurist manifesto. He despised Italy's reliance on its classical heritage and was disdainful of its present culture. His manifesto was deliberately outrageous. A motor car, he declared, is more beautiful than the winged victory of Samothrace, as seen on your right-hand screen. The famous Greek masterpiece from the Hellenistic era to be found in the Louvre, and today very grandly displayed on the Daru staircase, the modern and monumental Daru staircase. The manifesto further claims our attention with remarks like the following: we want to glorify war, the world's hygiene. We want to demolish museums and libraries. We will sing of the great crowds agitated by work, pleasure, and revolt, the multicolored and polyphonic surf of revolutions in modern capitals. Marinetti repeatedly urges his readers to have nothing more to do with the past. He goes on to explain, it is in Italy that we are issuing this manifesto of ruinous and incendiary violence, by which we today are founding futurism, because we want to deliver Italy from its gangrene of professors, archaeologists, tourist guides, and antiquaries. Italy has been too long the great second-hand market. We want to get rid of the innumerable museums which cover it with innumerable cemeteries. Interestingly, although this manifesto was first published in a newspaper in Bologna in early February, it was republished a few days later on the front page of the most popular French newspaper, Le Figaro, after which, of course, it became the talking point of all Europe. Marinetti was nothing if not ambitious, and he knew well that Paris, not Milan, was the cultural capital of Europe. Standing on the World Summit, the manifesto ends, we launch once again our insolent challenge to the stars. The Italian futurists followed this manifesto with many others, but they were not the only artists at this time, in the period just before the First World War, to find the Western European tradition tired, worn out, decadent, and oppressive. Picasso and Braque turned their back on it and developed Cubism, a profoundly radical investigation into methods of representation in order to get away from the mimetic, the mere copying of appearances. Having introduced a faceting of form as a way to suggest movement, different viewpoints, relativism, uncertainty, and what lies beneath the surface of things, Picasso began to worry around 1910 that he and Braque were moving closer and closer to abstraction and losing touch with their subjects. And so he turned to portrait painting, a genre where a degree of likeness is necessary to the recognition of the sitter, and therefore to the success of the project. Off his own bat, he embarked on portraits of three dealers known to him. The second of these, as you see on your left side, on the left side of the screen, of Ambroise Vollard. And here you can see that the pool of light helps draw attention to his head. Not only that, we can actually identify the light source, which seems to come from the top left. So Picasso is here still holding on to one of the tricks of the painter's trade, the way that light can situate a figure or an object in space. But what is space? If you thrust your fist into a bowl of water, you dislodge the water and raise its level in the bowl. But space is different. It runs not round a fist, but through it, being the necessary condition in which objects can exist and move. So although the light helps us identify Vollard by revealing his bald head, as well as his habitual saturnine expression as he sits reading, the representation of space is more difficult. His body seems to be made of a dense tangle of diagonal lines, acute angles and triangles, which at the bottom of the picture turn into the tips of his waistcoat and help, therefore, fix him in position. Now contrast this picture with Picasso's next portrait, the one on the right of Daniel Henry Kahnweiler. On the right-hand screen, you will see that the repeated beat is no longer the diagonal, but an emphasis on the short horizontal line, which gives to the composition a more calming effect. And what about the light? Where is its source? If it has a source, it seems to emanate in shimmering bursts from the canvas itself. This portrait of Kahnweiler, I think, has a greatness which the Vollard lacks, perhaps because Picasso here portrays space, not as something you can measure, but as something that is an intimate relationship with matter, a relationship that he seeks here to convey. Notice again that small details are used to pinpoint the figure. Again, you get his hands indicated at the bottom here. Then there's this waistcoat, the chain, his watch chain across the waistcoat, echoed further in his one side of his moustache, again in the lock of greasy hair, the couple of locks at the top of his head. All these act like mnemonics to remind us of Kahnweiler's actual and physical existence outside of the painting. But what is strikingly original about this picture is the way that matter and space now seem woven together, and that we cannot be precise as to where Kahnweiler's body begins and ends. Well, Cubism threw up a far-reaching challenge to the representational methods by the old masters in the Western European tradition. But were artists in England being so bold? Well, they seem to be clinging a little more happily to the old master tradition, to the Western European tradition. If you had gone to the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy in 1910 with good money to spend, you could have purchased Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema's A Favourite Custom, which offers much to admire. Witness the perspectival wizardry he achieves by giving great care to the sunlit white mosaic floor. You may be forgiven for feeling that much has been obtained in the foreground from a theatrical costumier, and that the faces of the two women in the foreground are somehow more Edwardian than Roman. This Dutch artist had come to England in 1860 and made his name by concentrating on classical subjects, in other words, domestic scenes set in ancient Greece or Rome. These enabled him to buy a large house in St. John Wood. They gained him a knighthood and eventually the Order of Merit. His work was especially attractive to self-made industrial magnates who, lacking a classical education, wanted to own paintings that suggested familiarity with the classical world and often made a good starting point for conversation after dinner. The second Alma-Tadema I will show you is called Unconscious Rivals. And at first I thought, why has it got that title? Is it the sort of competition between the beauty of the flowering bush and the two women? No, how stupid that was. The title, of course, refers to the unconscious rivalry between the two women as both are daydreaming about the same man, absent possibly because he is fighting a war elsewhere. Alma Tadema's craftsmanship and knowledge of archaeology informs his correct reproduction here of a Herculaneum wall decoration as the ceiling, and further recognizable detail from that era can be found in the carving on the balcony. But does all this archaeological detail redeem this vapid soap opera? Alma Tadema died in 1912, and the following year a memorial of his exhibition was shown at the Royal Academy, which Roger Fry reviewed. He observed that this artist, I quote, caters with the amazing industry and ingenuity which we note in all Sir Lawrence Alma Tadema's work for an extreme of mental and imaginative laziness. He gave his pictures expensive quality of shop finish, an extreme instance of the commercial materialism of our civilization. After this and other comments, Sir William Blake Richmond, a leading figure in the art world, suggested that the society should boycott Fry. Roger Fry is known as the person who turned the world upside down in 1910 and again in 1912 by bringing two post-impressionist exhibitions to London. He was aware that developments in art that had taken place in France over the last 30 years had largely gone unnoticed in this country. Included in his first exhibition were bundles of Cézannes, Gauguins and Van Goghs. And if you compare this, the Van Gogh, there's the poster for the second exhibition while it's on the screen. It shows a fashionable woman looking in horror at the announcement of yet more post-impressionist art. But the comparison I want you to make between Alma Tadema and Van Gogh and the Matisse shown here does perhaps explain why many people looked in horror at this art. There was a general feeling that one critic claimed that Van Gogh's drawing was on the level of a child of 6, another declared his art to be the output of the lunatic asylum, and there was a general feeling that standards of beauty in this country were being undermined. When it was showing Lady Bonham Carter around the second post-impressionist exhibition, they paused in front of this early version of Matisse's dance, and Lady Bonham Carter complained about the shape of the legs. Fry urged her instead to study the spaces in between the legs, shifting her attention from the representational subject to the formal content. It's fascinating that Matisse himself made a visit to London in October and November 1919 and made 4 visits to the British Museum, as is recorded in the visitor's book in the Prints and Drawings department. And his main purpose was to view Chinese collections. He reported back to a friend, "A poet showed me all the splendors of the Chinese masters. It was a revelation, a new world to me. All the barriers of race and time collapsed before me, since I was forced to realize that these Chinese, 1,000 years ago, had already seen our problems and had resolved them more or less in the same way we have today." Well, that was Matisse describing an experience he had in 1919. But 7 years before, in the catalogue to the second post-impressionist exhibition in London, Roger Fry had written, "Matisse aims at convincing us of the reality of his forms by the continuity and flow of his rhythmic line, by the logic of his space relations, and above all by an entirely new use of color. In this, as in his markedly rhythmic design, he approaches more than any other European the ideals of Chinese art." I find it interesting that, it's gone. That's the next one, I think. Yes, here we are. That in one of his own paintings by Roger Fry, he painted these 3 items, as you can see in the still life on your left-hand screen in 1917. First, we find a lily in a glass bottle. Next to it, a Chinese figurine, behind which is something that looks like an abstract black line, perhaps a bit of vorticism, but it is in fact part of the black and white beaded African arrow bag shown on the right-hand side of the screen, which in 1917 was in Roger Fry's possession. This same year, while joint editor of the Burlington magazine, he wrote to 2 Parisian dealers asking if they knew of anyone who could write about African art for the Burlington. Now, it is clear from the book we just glimpsed before this, called Vision and Design, published in 1920, that Fry very much wanted to promote an interest in cultures distant in time or in place to our own, and thereby to expand the parameters of the Western European tradition. On a visit to Paris in 1919, he met Paul Guillaume, a dealer in modern art who had recently published the first book in France that focused on African and oceanic carvings as art objects. At that date, Fry also saw the artist André Derain's collection of African and oceanic art. Certain at this time, Vlaminck and Picasso already had examples in their studios of art that had nothing to do with Greco-Roman or Italian Renaissance search for the ideal human proportions and perfect beauty. And in London, the sculptor Jacob Epstein already had a large collection of African and oceanic art. Well, the person responsible for bringing African art into the central position within the avant-garde was this Guillaume, who here portrayed by Modigliani. If we move on. Having discovered African art almost by chance, it was the poet Apollinaire who encouraged him to take a serious interest in it. And in 1919, he curated a major exhibition of African and oceanic carvings in Paris. It afterwards, or parts of it, went on tour. It came to London in the same year, 1919, and was shown at the Chelsea Book Club. Roger Fry not only reviewed this exhibition for the Athenaeum, but he also insisted that his review should be squeezed into the proofs of his book, Vision and Design. And in 1924, Fry himself acquired this African mask in Paris. Now, when Vision and Design appeared in 1920, it was read by a young man in Leeds who used the Leeds Art Reference Library. He was a student at Leeds School of Art, and he had opted to study sculpture in his second year. His classes were governed by technical demonstrations and academic methods that upheld the classical past. Imagine, therefore, when this young man, who you probably guessed is Henry Moore, had the awakening he must have had on reading Fry's opening words to his essay on African carving. Here they are. What a comfortable furniture the generalizations of a century ago must have afforded. What a right little, tight little, round little world it was then, when Greece was the only source of culture, when Greek art, even in Roman copies, was the only indisputable art, except for some Renaissance repetitions. Philosophy, the love of truth, drama, all these were the fruits of a special kind of life. Consequently, if we could only learn the Greek lessons of political freedom and intellectual self-consciousness, all the rest would be added to us. And now, in the last 60 years, Roger Fry continues, knowledge and perception have poured upon us so fast that the whole well-ordered system has been blown away. Fry was aware when he wrote this essay that most people in England thought that African art only offered ethnographic interest. Therefore, his conclusion was trumpeted loud and clear. But do also remember that actually Guillaume's collection, which he lent, I think, to this exhibition, was of very high quality African art. Fry writes, we have the habit of thinking that the power to create expressive plastic form is one of the greatest human achievements. And the names of great sculptors are handed down from generation to generation, so that it seems unfair to be forced to admit that certain nameless Africans have this power not only in a higher degree than we at this moment, but than we as a nation have ever possessed. Some of these things are great sculpture, greater, I think, than anything we produced, even in the Middle Ages. Certainly they have the special qualities of sculpture in a higher degree. So, reading this article on African art and other essays on ancient American art, Mohammedan art, and The Art of Bushmen, all in vision and design, blew Henry Moore away. He called the book the most lucky discovery. Fry was encouraging people to look outside the Western European tradition, and in this way helped expand the canon of art. Moore later remarked, once you'd read Roger Fry, the whole thing was there. And when he went to London to study at the Royal College of Art, it opened for him the doors of the British Museum, where he often spent more hours in the week than at the Royal College of Art. He was perhaps more prepared than this suggests. Near Castleford, a mining town in Yorkshire with a polluted river nearby where he grew up, was a small town called Methley. The headmaster of his school in Castleford had a great interest in church architecture and the habit of now and then announcing that a walk would replace the afternoon classes. Almost certainly it was he who first introduced Moore to Methley Church. Seen here, inside of which is perhaps an astonishing array of major church monuments, rich in historical associations. It was the I have not time to begin to explain who they are and so on, because there's not time, but just to give you visual images of them, it will, I think, be enough. These two wonderful ones, this one Moore particularly liked. His attention was immediately caught. There's many more. There's a triplicate one further on, and then later on classical monuments. The whole church is riddled with these monuments. But his attention was also caught by the corbels in the 14th century chancel, two of which you see here. There are 8 in all. It is apparently a vernacular custom to make satirical portraits of the master stonemason or whoever are other principal figures in the building trade. But these corbels, of which there are 8, as I've mentioned, are extra large in size and bursting with vitality. The monuments and corbels were Moore's first encounter with sculpture. Afterwards, when visiting his aunt who lived nearby, he would frequently revisit this church, and many years later he made generous donations to the cost of repairs for some of these monuments. But in London, after reading Vision and Design, his notebooks revealed that he worked his way through all the different cultures represented in the British Museum, with the aim of achieving a world view of sculpture. He took especial enjoyment of the ethnographic galleries, as they were called. Here, glass cases overflowed with objects from Asia, Africa, America, and Oceania. Moore later described them as overcrowded and jumbled together like junk in a marine store. His study of objects in the British Museum enabled him to find new ways in which to enhance the strength and expressive reality of his own art. Entering the British Museum, Henry Moore later recollected, made him feel like, I quote him, a starved man having Selfridge's grocery department all to himself. And one of the first things that he delighted in was I'm sorry, this is a blurred slide, the giant fragment, Amenhotep II's enormous 18-foot-long red granite arm terminating in a clenched fist. It made him realize how monumental and impressive sculpture could be. But it was not just size that Moore discovered in other Egyptian pieces. There he found a monumentality of vision. He explained, the Egyptians in their sculpture wanted to show that life had a greater significance than the ordinary daily routine of living. They managed to imbue a grandeur, a permanence, and some sort of religious meaning into their sculptures. I admire works of art which have this more than everyday feeling. His distrust of the futurist's attempt to show movement in sculpture made him especially appreciative of the stillness and timelessness in Egyptian art. Look at this statue of, sorry, did I miss one there? The first one that you were looking at is the Horemheb and one of his wives, seated on chairs with lion paws. And in this one, he noticed, I quote him, a superb sense of repose and serenity was conveyed by their arms. Here is another Egyptian sculpture in which further memories of it, which may have reflected Moore's own work. Notice the woman's hand peeping around the man's body under his arm. And Moore definitely had this fascination with arms and clasped hands, and you can see it very clearly in a work by himself called Girl with Clasped Hands. I want you to feel here that this is not the product of a predominantly Western European tradition. It's bringing together a style of figuration that is a blending, I think, of more than one culture. When Walter Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus, the most influential art school of the 20th century, came to London in 1934, which British artist impressed him most? The answer is Henry Moore. And this is hardly surprising. No other artist drew on such a wide range of sources or pursued variations on thematic themes, thematic ideas with such imaginative energy. It is widely known that Moore's great reclining figures took their starting point from a Mexican statue of the rain goddess, Xacmul. I prefer Mexican to Mayan sculpture, he once said. Mexican stone sculptures have a largeness of scale and a grim, sublime austerity, a real stoniness. His own work on the reclining figure underwent extensive modulations. He assimilated allusions to hills and caves, he shattered the body into two or more parts, or he courted surrealist disquiet. Moore knew that shapes and forms tap into our subconscious and activate a deep seam of human memories. And what makes his work so resonant is often its ambiguity. No single expressive vein prevails. The meaning of any piece remains unfixed. When asked why Xacmul had such impact on him, he replied, "Its stillness and alertness and sense of readiness and the whole presence of it and the legs coming down like columns." Elsewhere in the privacy of his own notebook, he wrote, "Keep ever prominent the world tradition, the big view of sculpture." Well, now, let's turn to something different, to another way of turning the world upside down. This is Maya Lin's Ghost Forest, made in 2021. You probably know that this artist came to fame in 1981 when she won the anonymous competition for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. at the age of 21, still a student studying architecture at Yale, not yet graduated. But during her childhood in rural Ohio, Maya Lin had been consistently interested in the relationship between people and their environment. She developed a growing awareness of ecology and of the need to respect nature. And in her earthworks, sculptures, and installations, she repeatedly sought a tension and balance between the man-made and the natural. And she's also very good at bringing to attention aspects of landscape of which the wider public might not be aware. So the term ghost forest is of a forest, of course, that has died. Maya Lin's Ghost Forest, commissioned by the Madison Square Park Conservancy, as you see here, amounted to a 6-month installation, which drew attention to the damage done to the white cedar tree populations on the east coast of America, owing to past logging practices, rising sea levels, and other things. Under different conditions, these vibrant, towering Atlantic cedar trees with their abundant vegetation are magnificent to behold. The 49 trees Lin had felled and brought to Madison Square Park, when installed, were over 40 feet tall, yet leafless and dead, having originally been part of regeneration efforts in the fragile ecosystem of the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. When seen here in Madison Park Square among other healthy trees, they immediately became a harsh symbol of the devastation caused by climate change and a warning of a looming environmental calamity. Owing to the vision of Maya Lin, a rural crisis had been brought into the heart of Manhattan and was on daily view. Her artist's statement read as follows: "We have very little time left to change our climate change emission patterns and how we live within the natural world. I wanted to bring awareness to a die-off that is happening all over the world. I also feel that a potential solution is through nature-based practices, changing our forestry practices, reforming our agricultural and ranching practices, and increasing our wetlands," and so on. Well, despite COVID-19 and the intermittent lockdowns, 2021 saw many forms of protest, often inspired by an awareness of what is missing or overlooked in our vision of the world. And the one I want to talk about now is Chila Burman's Winter Commission, installed during the winter of 2020 and 21 at Tate Britain. Chila has been and still is a key figure in the black art movement when it began in the 1980s and 90s. And her name appears in Lubena Himid's map, the thin black line. And she also appeared in one of the 3 important exhibitions that Himid put on under this title in the early 1980s, which marked the arrival on the British art scene of a radical generation of young black and Asian women artists. Chila, to give her full name, Chila Kumari Singh Burman, was a bit daunted by Tate Britain when she first came to London to take up a place at the Slade. Her parents had come to Britain from the Indian Punjab in the early 50s, and she had been born in Liverpool, one of 4 children, but the one who seems to have had been most available to help out her father when, despairing of getting work as a tailor, as he'd been trained, he turned and bought an ice cream van, and this, of course, needed cleaning out every day, and the money collected needed counting, tasks that Chila took on. To ensure success in this field, her father did 2 other things. Having noticed in Liverpool and Manchester that people who do well in life are often called Burman, he changed his name to Burman, despite its lack of Indian connotations, and he acquired a large image of a Bengali tiger, which he placed on top of the ice cream's roof. Photos of it on the beach at Liverpool, attracting queues of children, attest to its success, and versions of it often reappear in Chila's work. And one of these is currently under consideration for the Trafalgar Square's 4th plinth. She remains very proud of it, I mean the ice cream van, and the contribution it made to her family's financial security. Now, becoming part of a militant vanguard brought her respect, but it did not necessarily make her fame or fortune. But in recent years, she has achieved high visibility in British cultural life. On arriving at the Aubrey Beardsley preview at Tate Britain in March 2000, she greeted Alex Farquharson, the director of the Tate, with the remark, "How do you like my black lippy?" "Very much," he replied, "and it explains why you are wearing a silver jacket." This meeting of minds may explain why the following morning Farquharson sat down and wrote Burman an email, and he's kindly permitted me to allow to quote what he has what he wrote. What he was offering her was the Winter Commission to alter part of Tate Britain, something that had gone on the times before. Oh dear, I seem to have lost the... Here we are. I'm writing to ask if you would be interested in doing this year's Winter Commission on the outside of our building. Don't forget that throughout March of 2020, the Tate, like other museums, was closed. I'm sure you're aware of this series. So far we have had 3. We want to keep this festive and brighten up the building at the darkest time of the year in a fun, imaginative, inclusive and appealing way, appealing to all ages. We also want it to depart from / play off the formality / classicism / Victorian identity of the building and relax it and make it more democratic. Signal that we're for everyone. This commission began as an alternative to our long series of artist-designed Christmas trees. And could you be interested in referencing the visual culture of different religions, cultural traditions, ? Well, you can imagine that it might seem rather difficult to make this building look fun and appealing. But had to kickstart the project, Farquharson arranged for Burman to be sent an architectural drawing of the building that you see on the screen, the main Tate entrance for many years. Never before had Chila been given such a major opportunity to create a trans-cultural work of art, for her intent was to intervene between the British public and one of its most popular national museums by clothing the latter with Indian decorations and Hindu gaiety. One world was to be transported and brought into engagement with another. Well, of course, behind the light-heartedness of what Burman set out to do lie histories of imperialism, colonialism, and geopolitical clashes. Shila's parents only spoke very infrequently about their time in the Indian Punjab post-partition. Nevertheless, an awareness of things large and small inevitably powers her rebelliousness. When she studied at Leeds Polytechnic before going on to the Slade and the RCA, she found the city stimulating in an age of punk, reggae and rock. But she was informed there that the ethnic culture she brought with her had no relevance to a fine art course in Britain. Yet at this time, when she rang home, Punjabi had to be, of necessity, the language of choice, as it had been when she was a child. The direction in which Burman's ideas were moving with her plans for the Tate project can be found in drawings. Having photocopied the architectural drawing provided by the Tate, Burman subjected these stoppies to various mark-making activities. 2 flights of steps leading up here. They've been an attraction for many things, celebration and protest. I won't go through all these, but this is Sir Norman Reed when he was the director at the Tate. He wanted to celebrate Picasso's 90th birthday, so he got 89 children to help with this, and they all stood on the steps holding a white dove, and at the right moment, they all let them off in celebration of Picasso. So you can see that when the building had first been conceived, I just wanted to put this in for this audience. Henry Tate, who paid for it to be built, the man who donated his paintings to Tate and put up 80,000 for the building of the Tate Gallery, as it was first eventually called, and then later became Tate Britain. He paid for his architect to go travelling around Europe and beyond and bring back new ideas. He'd been building a lot of libraries in South London, partly for Henry Tate, but he came back and he produced this drawing of what he thought a national gallery of modern British art, it was thought to be then, should look like. So he took it to Sir William Harcourt to see, Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, and Harcourt was simply appalled and said he couldn't cope with this at all. And so what did he do? He said, you must go to Cambridge and you must look at the Fitzwilliam. And he said, its single merit is a lack of meretricious detail. So off he went to see that. And so there's the Fitzwilliam, of course. And this is what Chila was doing to make the building we've already seen become a little more different. And you can see she's thrown at it a lot of glitter, Indian love of design, jewellery and so on, in a sort of Indian style. And this is one of the most densely finished drawings that she managed to do at this time. But she was still feeling that she hadn't quite found what medium or what would bring this enormous building to life. It's, after all, quite a big thing to take on. And so on a trip to visit Walthamstow to see a friend in 2020, a friend took her to see God's Own Junkyard. So I just go on to it here. This is God's Own Junkyard, an art store and workshop on an industrial estate stuffed full of colourful neon and light bulb signs and other eclectic pieces. The owner, Chris Bracey, had established its fame by repairing and renting out items from the junkyard for use in movies and on the stage. They now go to restaurants and all sorts of places. At the time, London was facing the threat of another return to a COVID lockdown, and Burman, encountering such colourful effulgence at Bracey's workshop, found herself thinking that if the population was moving into another dark tunnel, it would be best to emerge from it into some kind of light. The intensity and vibrancy of neon, she realized, was both artistically and politically desirable. It could offer certainty and direction like a lighthouse in an uncertain world. And it's possible that her childhood memories of visiting Blackpool illuminations also played a part. And just to go back, also she thought it might be nice to do something with those steps that we've seen. And so all the drawings that she quite often does on her mobile phone were pulled out and made into strips on vinyl, which could be cut up and put on the riser of each step, as you will see in a minute. Incidentally, the chap on the left who helped put them on the steps and print these pictures was heard saying as he put them down on the riser, I never thought I'd be covering over the steps of the posh people. So here was what was happening to Tate Britain as it got going, but it was the decision to use light, but it was a blow to discover how expensive glass neons could be. Soon after, however, Burman learned that the technology surrounding neon had moved on, owing to the recognition that silicon could replace glass, and when combined with LED neon technology, could offer new and more flexible customization. Flexi-neon, as it is correctly called, is also more energy efficient, economical, and environmentally friendly. So Burman was introduced to a technician called Tim Meeker in this field, and before long he was making a head of the goddess Kali from the artist's drawings. This is the way it looks when the light descends. I mean, when the light goes dusk and dark descends. And I think then it really does come to light, because what neon allowed Chila to do is to use words. You can see love, shine, light, aim, dream, truth. And then underneath that in mauve is the title of the work, Remembering a Brave New World, inspired by one of her friends' great praise of Aldous Huxley's novel of that title. You will notice that the Britannia, who sits at the very top of the pediment, that's where the goddess Kali has covered her up, and similarly the lion and the unicorn have got things stuck over them. What you can't see, but I will show you in a minute, is the tiger that's running down the side of the one side of these steps, and various other things stuck all over it, which I don't think I'd go into detail because it would be too long. But even if it is slightly less powerful in daylight, it certainly was richly emblazoned with colour at the night. The fact that for Burman the first piece made by Tim Meeker was Kali is perhaps not surprising. Some goddesses would particularly have inspired her, and with their fierceness and power. And she also has a great admiration of someone called Lakshmi Bai, the Rani of Yanzi, a queen who became a fierce fighter for freedom and an inspirational figure in the history of India's resistance to colonial rule. And some pictures of her can be seen on the columns in daylight. What I just want to draw your attention to before we leave it is partly the brilliance of the way she recreates the Bengali tiger, and secondly the image of her father's ice cream van, which appears on the steps, and which carries a telling message, one of Abhilavana's Sivanandan's celebrated aphorisms: "We are here because you were there." It is an easy-to-remember encapsulation of complex ideas that challenge simplistic assumptions. I want just to end by doing a little bit on the Chinese, there's Chila standing on the steps, by talking just a small amount about this exhibition that occurred was put up in 2020-21 in the British Library, called Chinese and British. Incidentally, on the right here you see the first football player who played for England, the first non-white player to play for England, Frank Su. The idea for this exhibition came from someone called Dr. Lucienne Lowe at Liverpool University. She proposed this idea to the British Library, and they took it up. She curated the exhibition with Dr. Alex Tickle from the Open University in collaboration with 3 British Library curators. It included a reference to the longevity of China in this country, but also in Cambridge. And this, in many ways, this produced to be a model cultural event. One thing that I think made it so engaging was that it resisted the Western lens, and instead the story told came from the Chinese communities in and around Britain. At that date, before the arrival of the Hong Kongers, the Chinese population in this country amounted to something like 450,000 people, or 0.7% of the population in England and Wales. Even though its cuisine had been integrated into British culinary taste, it was still largely a voiceless population. And in addition, at the start of COVID, amid frequent references to Wuhan as the likely source of the pandemic, there was a 300% increase in hate crime against the Chinese in Britain. The success and achievement of this exhibition is suggested by the fact that 40% of its visitors were non-white, a percentage higher than any previous exhibition at the British Library. It began by reminding visitors of the Chinese presence in Britain in the past. And one simple example was that of Tan Che Kwa, who a Cantonese sculptor who happened to be visiting London or here for a certain period in 1770 when Johann Zoffany painted his famous picture of the Royal Academicians. And he squeezed, pressed the wrong one. He squeezed in Tan Kwai with a black hat just there between those two men to show that he was a part of things at that particular moment in time. He's known to have translated things for the British Museum, including a Japanese book on medicinal cures. So he was, in 1770, clearly part of the cross-cultural knowledge exchange within British intellectual life, and therefore an apt figure to be in this painting, which promotes the role of intellect in art. I just want to mention a couple of other peoples. Lu Guaijian, biochemist and expert on the history of science in China. But many of you may know that Lu's most important work was her long-standing collaboration with the Cambridge academic Joseph Needham. Lu is the most significant contributor to his influential book series Science and Civilization in China. Her own book, Celestial Lancets, concerns the history of acupuncture in China. And then another person, Xu Jimo, who is considered as one of the most important figures in the history of modern Chinese poetry. A lecture with slides delivered last night on him in King's College had a packed audience. A part of the new culture movement in China, Xu's work challenged tradition and promoted progress and modernity. After 3 years in the US, he studied at King's College, Cambridge in the early 1920s. And his poet, Saying Goodbye to Cambridge Again, is still recited across schools in China. And rather touching child's jacket was shown, made by her grandmother, it was worn by the jacket was made by the owner's mother for her granddaughter with cotton grown from their home in China and worn as she came on her journey to England. Well, while this exhibition was on, there was just a small extension to it, which was these 7 photographs taken by Jamie Lau. He was inspired by seeing a photograph of a black artist in an exhibition of boat photography in the V&A, who showed herself wearing walking boots in the Lake District countryside and looking very fed up. She said of it herself, this artist, "It is as if the black experience has only lived within an urban environment. I thought I liked the Lake District, where I wandered lonely as a black face in a sea white. A visit to the countryside is always accompanied by a feeling of unease, dread." And Jamie Lau was so upset by this because, being Chinese himself but living happily in Hove and loving walking on the South Downs, he wanted to show Chinese people in the countryside in rural settings and explain themselves in the stories they told, a paragraph story, why they were happy where they were. And, well, the only one I'm going to read to you tonight, I think, is Aseri, not this one, a food writer and TV chef who loves walking in forests, but this one by the Reverend Mark Nam. This was the story he wrote to go with this picture. More tea, vicar? An oh so familiar and typically English phrase uttered in parishes like mine. And yet I'm not your typical English parish priest, I'm Chinese too. Can I be both? If something as quintessentially English as tea can have Chinese origins, then surely a priest can too. If Christ has promised to reconcile all things unto himself, then surely even that which is east and that which is west can find wholeness and fullness of expression in him. This is the hope I hold on to. My name is Mark Nam. I am a British-born Chinese priest in the Church of England. Well, for a long time, the Western European tradition has succeeded in occupying this hallowed role in world culture. And why has it lasted so long? Gombrich provided one answer to this question in his The Story of Art. first published in 1950, with reference to the restlessness within Western culture in comparison with some Eastern cultures that have lasted almost unchanged for 1,000 years. His own book has done much to promote the Western view of art, having now reached its 16th edition, been translated into 30 languages, and sold 8 million copies. When Gombrich tried in the 12th edition to take the story of art up to the present day, he admitted some discomfort. Art veined with revolutionary spirit had aligned itself more easily with progressive developments, with primitivism, modernism, and modernity. Admittedly, modernism, modernity, and even postcolonialism, with its reaction against Western cultures, although moving towards globalisation, remains inextricably tied to the West, even during recent years when its socio-economic power has been challenged by global financial crises and troubled by the phenomenon of global warming. Yet when a leading institute of history of art in this country admits that the 2023 to 24 academic program, 2/3 of the classes are consigned to American and European art, then surely more revolution is needed, more cross-cultural exchange of the kind demonstrated by the British Library exhibition, Chinese and British, more interventions like Chila Burman's transformation of classical imperial public buildings into palaces of Hindu delight, more things that surprise and can turn the world upside down. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances, for a fascinating a new perspective in this series on revolution. I know many of you have to go, but just before you do, I really enjoyed, I think, most your reflections on the role of art and artists in depicting, documenting, and facilitating what you described at the beginning as a vital change, be it from the past or indeed the present and into the future. That's revolutions, be they political, cultural, or environmental. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you all for joining us. Do come back next week. We have Nick Lane, the Professor of Evolutionary Biochemistry from UCL, speaking on revolution in natural selection. But please join me again in saying thank you.